Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for that kind introduction. It's always tough to get up and speak after lunch when everybody is feeling a little drowsy, but I really want to thank you for the invitation to be with you today. And it's a real honor for me to get to know the Pacific Council because this is my first opportunity to be with you. And also to welcome you to the 37th District. Most people don't know where the districts are, but you are right in the middle of my congressional district. And as was mentioned, I was born and raised right here in Los Angeles and am so honored to be in Congress. You know, you have in your room here one of our giants that we miss dearly. Where's Howard Berman? There's Howard Berman. We need to give Howard Berman a round of applause. Howard, is deeply missed, as I mentioned, in Congress, but in our community and in our country has really been a giant on international affairs. And I have to tell you that the reason why I was on the Foreign Affairs Committee and the reason why I'm ranking member on the Africa Subcommittee is because Howard Berman did that before he left Congress. And so I'm very honored that I get to serve in this capacity. And I do want to say something that I know will shock you, and it will certainly shock Gerald. I'm not sure where he is, but when he described Washington, D.C. and the partisanship, and we don't get along on anything, Africa is actually a bipartisan issue. It is a bipartisan issue. I work really well with my Republican colleagues on Africa. Howard told me that. He told me that I would. Susan Rice, Ambassador Rice, told me the same thing. Grant asked me before the lunch, why is Africa a bipartisan issue? I'm not really sure, but I'm okay with that. I'll take what I can get. But, you know, I do think it's so important, and I'm very appreciative that you guys are looking at the question of Africa because, you know, in our country, we don't know a lot about Africa. And in Congress, even though Africa's a bipartisan issue, my colleagues still really don't know a lot about Africa. And so I always cringe at late night TV when you're watching TV and you show the kids that are starving and they have flies. And what our perception of Africa is that it's a continent of conflict, of chaos, constant crisis, of corruption and incompetence, and a continent that always needs our charity. And one of the reasons why I want to be in Congress, why I'm in Congress now, is so that I can work on Africa issues, but so that I could work to change our perception of the continent. Because frankly, we're behind the 8 ball. The rest of the world knows that Africa is a land of opportunity. The rest of the world knows how big Africa is, which is something that a lot of people in the United States don't realize. You can take the continental United States and fit it on the continent of Africa 3 times. There's 54 countries on the continent of Africa. We tend to focus on the ones that are problematic, but we don't realize that the majority of the continent is actually peaceful. The continent is poor. There are structural problems that need to be resolved. I think a lot of the continent suffers from the vestiges of colonialism, but China and Russia and India and Brazil all are very clear about the opportunities that the continent provides. So my commitment is to really change how we view the continent of Africa, and policy and funding follows your perspective. And so that's why I think it's so critical that we begin to be far more knowledgeable about the continent. So the last 2 administrations led efforts that really did begin to shift the paradigm and supported building capacity of African nations to do for themselves versus a charitable approach where US-based nonprofits provide services for poor Africans. And so we need to have a change in the mindset. So I want to mention a couple of those programs. Under the Obama administration, and I'm sure we'll talk about this some in the dialogue, the Obama administration created a program called Feed the Future. Well, prior to Feed the Future, we exported food to Africa. Why do we need to send food to Africa when Africa has more land and more possibility? Africa actually has the capacity to feed the world. So instead of sending food to Africa, how about sharing our technology and our knowledge about farming? How about helping Africans reach the capacity so they can farm for themselves, export between countries, and export to us? Well, quiet as it's kept, one of the reasons why we export food to Africa is because we're getting rid of food here, right? And also, instead of feeding people here who actually are hungry, we ship it to Africa. So we had to wage this big fight, actually, within Congress, and I was really surprised that I had to fight amongst my Democratic colleagues. I think you were there when we had that fight, Howard, where a lot of the Democrats felt, well, providing that form of charity to the continent created goodwill, and that's why we should continue it, as opposed to, in some instances, we were actually compromising and destroying the local markets. So if I'm a farmer and I farm rice, I have my whole crop and I'm ready to take it to market, and then the great Americans come over with a huge shipment of rice, and I'm done. And so Feed the Future actually was beginning to change the paradigm. 2/3 of the continent lacks electricity. One of the other Obama initiatives was Electrify Africa. We've been providing foreign aid to Africa for decades. Why haven't we focused on assisting with the infrastructure so Africa, again, could do for itself and be an equal trading partner? So there are obviously a lot of security issues. And the security issues, though, I think we have to look at very differently, because it's different than the Cold War, where you had conflicts over ideology. And yeah, some of it is ideological. So Boko Haram, that's a group that, in my mind, wants to take us back to the 10th century, just like the Taliban and ISIS. But a lot of the young people that get involved with Boko Haram are getting involved for non-ideological reasons. That's how they eat. So if you're going to address the security issues, we have to do that. But you have to address the root causes for why there's security issues in the first place. One of the initiatives of the Bush administration, and by the way, I just have to tell you, as a lifelong Democrat, when I first went to Africa, I was shocked at what a hero Bush 43 is and was. I was really stunned. Everywhere I went, people talked about how wonderful Bush was. I'm like, is this the same guy? But, but you have to give him his due. I mean, he is known for PEPFAR. He saved millions of lives, because of HIV/AIDS. But he's also known for the Millennium Challenge Corporation, which is us providing funding, but in a different way. It's about building the infrastructure and building the capacity of Africans to do for themselves. And to me, that's the model in which our foreign aid should go. So many people here might know that 7 out of the 10 fastest growing economies are on the continent of Africa. So if you're going to think about investments and you're going to think about business, then we need to think about the continent of Africa. You mentioned, Gerald, about the work in the mayor's office. I've been talking to the mayor for the last couple of years about doing a trade mission to Africa, and I'm hoping that that's something that the Pacific Council could be involved in, because that's never happened before. And it certainly should, because sometimes I think we don't realize that we have a huge diaspora community here. I mean, everybody knows where little Ethiopia is, but we have diaspora from lots of different African countries, and a lot of Africans involved in the diaspora are very much involved in business on the continent. That's something that I saw when I was there last year. I was in Nigeria, and I was really excited to see that there's a whole tech boom going on in Nigeria, and a lot of Nigerian young people who were educated in the United States, worked in the tech industry here, and have now gone home and are starting tech businesses there. So there's so many ways that we could bring our two continents together and look for ways to build a partnership and change that paradigm away from we're the great United States providing charitable aid. Okay, so there's security, there's also democracy. You hear about it in the news when it goes bad, you don't necessarily hear about it when it goes fine. So I wanted to give you one example of a bad and good. So there was an election in the Gambia, and the guy in charge there had been in office for decades and was a little crazy. And anyway, he lost his election, and he agreed to step down. And then a week or two later, he changed his mind and said, it was an election, but I think I'm going to stay. Well, the countries, Africa is divided into regions, and so ECOWAS, which is the Economic Community of the Western African States, got together and said, you know what, no, you're not going to stay. I will tell you that ECOWAS is led by a woman. the only female president on the continent of Africa, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, who's also a Nobel Prize winner. By the way, she's from Liberia. The election in Liberia was just a week ago. And so as the head of ECOWAS, she told the guy, no, you're not going to stay, because if you choose to stay, we're going to all get together and make you step down. So I was in Ghana in January for the inauguration of the Ghanaian president and had dinner with Johnson Sirleaf. And so a few days later, all the presidents from the Western African states got in a plane, flew over to the Gambia, and before they could land, he decided he changed his mind and he left. I raise that as an example because, again, that's an example nobody heard of, received no press, but it was Africans doing for themselves. And one of the ways I think our resources should be used is in helping those organizations like the African Union or the regional economic communities to strengthen their own capacity. I mentioned the root causes of the security issues. Another root cause is the youth bulge. So Africa is overwhelmingly a young continent. And if we don't figure out how to address the root causes and the economic situation, then it does lay the groundwork for terrorist organizations to do recruitment. So one of the initiatives of the last administration was called YALI, the Young African Leaders Initiative, and it was involved in every country on the continent and recruiting young leaders to come to the United States and then experience business, the nonprofit community, government, and then go back home. One of the biggest benefits of YALI was the fact that Africans connected with each other who would have never had that capacity to do that. And so they have been building this for the last 7 or 8 years, and now there is a huge cohort of young people that have come through YALI who now are all interacting with each other across borders. So let me just wrap up by mentioning a little bit about economic partnerships, which I know we'll talk about more. I mentioned Feed the Future and MCC, but one of the things that I feel we need to do now as a nation is we need to look to the continent and address the infrastructure issues. So I mentioned the fact that we need to help in terms of electricity. The other place where we need to help is transportation, and transportation on every level. Roads, airports, on the ocean, in the marine area. We need to help the continent, again, develop on its own, but we could do that in partnership with our businesses and corporations and companies on the continent of Africa. So when I think of Global LA, I think of Global LA from the perspective of Africa. I am hoping that, again, the Pacific Council will think about involvement and maybe helping and working in partnership with the mayor's office so that we could have a trade mission from Los Angeles to somewhere on the continent. We could pick lots of places. A lot of times when people think of Africa, they go to South Africa. Well, there's a whole lot of countries that we could go to that are peaceful, that their economies are growing, and are ripe and very much interested in our involvement. Thank you very much.
Thank you for doing that. Great, thank you very much. You've definitely painted the picture of both the economic opportunity and then also real transnational threats and challenges. And so I was hoping to ask you a couple of questions about each of those. But to start, this was really a call to action from you in terms of trade and investment and shifting from an aid mentality to more of a self-interested economic rationale that U.S. companies need to be there. And so with that in mind, I wanted to ask about China's role, as you alluded to, and what the U.S. government should be doing. And just to take the scene a little bit further, we've seen in the statistics recently in 2016, China doubled its foreign direct investment in Africa over the course of 2016. That's 10 times the value of American investment. And so I wanted to know from your perspective, what can we do as we look at the Export-Import Bank, which has a specific mandate to do more in Africa dating back to 1997. It's still outpaced by 37 times compared to the Chinese Export-Import Bank in this context, with other countries, as you said, supporting their companies. We realize there are issues that African governments should do. We realize that U.S. companies need to do more. But from the government perspective, what should be done to actually help support companies and facilitate greater investment?
There is so much frustration and so much criticism about China's involvement in Africa. I think we need to stop criticizing China's involvement in Africa and step up our own. Because you think about it, what are the Africans supposed to do? And people will tell you, and I know Grant knows this, everywhere you go in Africa, if they had a choice between China and the United States, they would choose the United States. But if the United States is not there, then what are they supposed to do? Now we do have some real problems in terms of competing with China because the Chinese can, their corporations and their government, most of the time is the same thing. And they don't have any problem bankrolling it. So it's different than our, private investment. And then I think in terms of U.S. companies, and I know there's plenty of companies represented here, U.S. companies are dealing with the perception of the continent of Africa, and so there is reluctance to being involved. But, governmental entities like the Exim Bank and OPEC can help U.S. companies being involved on the continent. So when we do silly things in Congress, like not want to reauthorize the Exim Bank, then that doesn't just cripple us on the continent of Africa, that cripples us in a lot of different places. And OPEC is the entity that helps provide insurance so that if as a company you want to go over and invest, you have some reasonable assurance. And so in Congress, OPEC for the most part is supported, but there's enough opposition that OPEC gets challenged. And some of the governmental entities actually make money. So I'm not quite sure why my colleagues are so opposed to these entities. And some of my colleagues, it's an ideological question over foreign aid that they're opposed to. When I first got there, for example, a number of us were joking that we were going to put legislation forward that said we were going to cut foreign aid to 10% of the budget. Now, foreign aid is 1%, right? But there is the perception that 40% of our budget goes to foreign affairs. So I really think that the onus is on us. I think that we have to step up, and I think that the Africans are waiting with open arms.
Well, speaking of the onus being on you, and as some proposals, including the president's budget, would have zeroed out the U.S. Trade and Development Agency and the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, two of the tools for Electrify Africa and Power Africa that you mentioned. But even more than that, more broadly, it put forward a very specific point of view in terms of the State Department and assistance. What is your view and the role of Congress here in terms of those undergirding the policies on Africa that you deem so important?
Well, Dasan, so the role of Congress is to reject the budget. That's the role of Congress, really. It's really true. So, and you would be happy to know that we did that on a very bipartisan basis. So when in the Foreign Affairs Committee, when the administration came forward and presented their budget, I was very pleased that there was just no support on the committee at all. But in addition to the cuts that you described, there were also other cuts that are proposed, and some of the cuts I worry about. Some of them I feel okay, then I know my colleagues across the aisle are going to reject them. You do understand that to pass the budget, there are no Democrats. The Republicans can pass the budget on their own. They don't need one vote from us. So this really, it is a partisan issue in the sense that the Republicans control the majority and they have such a large majority in the House that they do not need our votes. When they need our votes, it's because they're not getting along. And that's the same thing in the Senate. So you have budget items like international family planning. And you might not think about that automatically when you're thinking about Africa and you're thinking about the economy, but it is absolutely an economic issue. And so maternal death on the continent of Africa is really high, and one of the reasons is because of the lack of family planning. Women can't space their pregnancies. You have to space your pregnancies for health reasons as well as for economic reasons. And so all of that related funding is really critical. So where I feel comfortable that my Republican colleagues are going to reject some of the cuts, well, when some of those cuts fall within their ideological arenas, like family planning, for example, I'm worried about that. So family planning was zeroed out. We'll see what happens in the long haul.
Okay. How confident are you in that regard for the programs you mentioned, the African Growth and Opportunity Act, which facilitates trade, Power Africa, the programs in engaging young African leaders? Will those survive going forward because of the support of Congress, or is it really an open question?
Well, one of the things about what's going on today is that you can only answer these questions in the moment. I don't know what's happened in the last half hour. So I really don't.
Fair enough.
So in the moment, I can say that I feel comfortable about YALI, Young African Leaders Initiative, because it's in the budget. And I can feel comfortable about Power Africa. Now, Power Africa as well as Feed the Future, both of those initiatives were Obama initiatives that Republicans, led by Congressman Ed Royce, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Committee, he took those Obama initiatives and very quietly put them into statute. So, and we know that Trump is obsessed behind erasing Obama from history, but at least those were put into statute. The other thing that I should say about the Foreign Affairs Committee under Chairman Royce's leadership, and also when Howard Berman was there, the Foreign Affairs Committee is a real bipartisan committee, and as a matter of fact, most of the time we don't even vote. And we don't vote because things are done by consensus. See? You don't know that. You think of us, you just think that all we do is fight. But when it comes to some areas, our big challenge is that news is not interested when we actually get something done and when we cooperate. And so it's frustrating to us because people ask me all the time, how can I stand to be there? I'm very honored and very happy to be there and I'm fortunate that the issues that I work on are actually bipartisan issues, and I'm able to get things done. I still make him go to breakfast with me, though, on a regular basis and help instruct me how to do that.
Excellent. Before opening up to the audience, I wanted to explore the security issues with you as well, because you were fair in pointing out that there are transnational threats emanating from some parts of the continent. You mentioned Al-Shabaab, there's Boko Haram. There are groups that have ties both to Al-Qaeda and to ISIS. And in terms of the number of casualties, Boko Haram actually is either the first or the second over the last few years of deadliest or most dangerous terrorist group in the world in terms of number of civilian casualties. How do you get at that issue in this environment when there's a lack of clarity on the policy, when there's a fight over the budget, which is really fundamental to what the U.S. engagement will look like, and when, as you said, you've got a burgeoning youthful population that needs jobs, that needs economic opportunities? How do you take the holistic approach that is needed when we're almost in stasis in this budget battle?
Well, and it really is a challenge. And I think, again, the challenge goes back to perception. It's unfortunate, but in our world, when Boko Haram, blows up and kills 40 people, it doesn't even make news coverage. If there is a bombing in France or in London or someplace here and 3 people are killed, news stops. So in part, there's almost an acceptance of this when it comes to the continent of Africa. And as you were referencing, Grant, I think it was last year, Boko Haram killed more folks than ISIS did. But again, as long as that was happening in Nigeria, there really wasn't a concern about it. So just like there's all the other perceptions about Africa, to me it's really important to lift that up. And also because this crisis is solvable by addressing, the root causes. And it all goes back to the economy as well. So I think it's real critical that we raise the issues, but we not raise them in a way that then people feel, well, that's just Africa and it's hopeless. So, given my background, you would have thought that my focus in Africa would have been humanitarian or something like that. I specifically don't work on it's not that I ignore those issues. But to me, as long as people feel like Africa is just so filled with problems, it's hopeless, they're, unsolvable, then you can't get anybody interested in the economics. So I have to focus on the economics as, again, root causes to address the other issues, but for people to see that the rest of the world is profiting off of doing business in Africa, we're the only ones that are asleep at the switch.
Great. Okay, Sleep at the Switch is a good place to open it up here because I know this is a group that is not asleep at the switch and has a lot of questions. So please, let's hear from the audience. What questions do you have for the Congress member? Yes, right here at the front table.
What's the nature of bribery and
So-
facilitating business? You know, I don't know where the countries stack up in their
Right.
clarity of.
So you know there's that international index, right?
Yeah.
And so you can look at countries where transparency is a huge issue, but then there are other countries like Botswana that scores very high. What should I say, high or low? It has a very good score in terms of corruption. And so with 54 countries, it is absolutely a mixed bag. But you have... Exactly. Well, they don't have several problems. I mean, they also are not looking at democracy, governance, and human rights either. You know what I mean? And that is certainly an impediment to our companies. But with all of the various countries, it's a mixed bag. But let me take Nigeria as an example, because everybody knows when you say Nigeria, I mean, what comes to mind? Corruption before Boko Haram and a lack of transparency. But when you talk to the business community, and I don't know if there's anybody here that is doing business in Nigeria, but in spite of Nigeria's challenges, Nigeria is still a very profitable place to work. You just have to know how to work in Nigeria. And that's, to me, also why the diaspora is such a resource. So if you're interested in doing business on the continent of Africa, working with diaspora could be very, very helpful way of doing that, in addition to the U.S. governmental organizations that help.
Congresswoman, thank you for being with us. AGOA, the African Growth Opportunities Act, which is essentially a trade facilitation, trade promotion agreement, has been a huge success in my judgment. How do you expect or foresee that the Trump administration's attack on trade agreements that we see in so many other parts of the world, has there been any indication as to what the Trump foreign policy and foreign international economic policy will be? And do you think AGOA is in any way, I know it just recently came up, if I'm not mistaken, for reauthorization, but do you think that AGOA is at risk in this environment?
I think he doesn't know about that one yet. And we're not talking a lot about it.
Keep your voice
just,
down. Yeah.
Right, exactly. Just for the audience, AGOA is the African Growth and Opportunity Act. It is our primary trade vehicle, but it's different. It's not a bilateral agreement. It basically has a list of several hundred, if not a couple thousand, commodities that can be shipped here without tariffs. That's the essence of AGOA. I would like to call it a big success, but you know, the majority of the continent doesn't even utilize AGOA. A lot of countries don't have the capacity to export to us because we're so large, our market is so large, that the volume in which they would have to export, they can't meet, which is why another part of AGOA is helping the countries, again, reach capacity. What we hope is that before the 10 years are up, we're hoping that some of the countries will graduate away from a one-sided trade agreement to a bilateral trade agreement. I could absolutely see the administration coming after it, but in all seriousness, it has not hit their radar.
You talk about changing the narrative and making people care. And there's so many crises around the world right now. There's so many crises in the U.S. There's so many issues in terms of natural disasters. How do you get people to focus on Africa? How do you get people to think about it differently that are not used to thinking about it the way that you think about it?
You know, and my primary way is by talking about Africa positively and pointing out the positive things that are happening in Africa. One of the things, I mean, there should be more tourism. There's a lot of tourism to the continent of Africa, but not so much from our country. And pointing out the positive, peaceful examples, I think, are real critical. And again, it's not that I don't want to address the crises, so let me give you another example of bipartisanship. The world is facing 4 potential famines, 3 of which are on the continent of Africa, Sudan, Nigeria, and Somalia. And 2 out of those 3 on the continent of Africa are due to conflict. So we got together on a bipartisan, bicameral basis and passed a $1 billion humanitarian relief package. And then I went over to South Sudan and Uganda and visited the refugee camps to push to make sure that the money was actually, had actually hit the ground. So I don't focus on those things. I just think it's important to talk about, the incredible things that are happening in Botswana, the development in Kenya, the peaceful election in Liberia, which just happened. It's still underway in the sense that they have a runoff. But educating people about how big Africa is and talking about some of the highlights is my way.
Great.
Congressman, in terms of the way in which the United States interacts with Africa, again, we've even in your talking today, you've mostly talked about Africa as sort of a homogeneous mass. But are there countries or a country that the U.S. should perhaps focus on, thinking that that country could then become a leader in Africa and start setting a really good example for other countries to follow? So again, an example perhaps of Africa helping itself rather than having people from outside impose their own ideas.
And you know what, because it's so big and there's so many countries, it is hard to talk about it in other ways. So maybe the best way to answer that is by thinking of a region. And so when I describe that Africa is divided into economic communities, the East African community is one where countries are doing well. Of course, there are some countries that are challenged there. But a lot of us believed that we should take a regional approach and really push the United States to focus on capacity building in a specific region that is doing well but could do a lot better. And so if the East African communities, East African Economic Community is doing well, and then we also support transportation and roads and all of that to other countries, would be of tremendous help. But I could think of one country, Nigeria. Nigeria is the largest economy on the continent. It surpassed South Africa a few years ago. Focusing on Nigeria would be of huge help because it is the most populous and the largest economy. And right now, our focus on Nigeria is security, and pretty much security only. And we need to get past that. The Nigerians could also use a lot of support from us in terms of military assistance, not from our military going there, but training their military.
Congresswoman, thank you for being here. I want to dovetail off what you just said about security. AFRICOM is 10 years old now. It was, I guess, established in 2006, sort of stood up and sort of formalized in 2007, 2008. But it's been in Germany.
African Command, that's our military. Yes, go ahead.
I've only been released from the military for a few months, so I'm working on not speaking in acronyms. But, listening to General Brown this morning, at some point he almost started to sound like the Chamber of Commerce for a pivot to Asia. Yeah. And there's a certain advocacy there. So the last thing you had said was this security cooperation. I feel like a lot of that's being done very well. I know the reasons for AFRICOM being placed in Europe were clear at the time. I was curious what your opinion is for the way ahead for AFRICOM and what you said as far as security cooperation. Thank you.
So the African Command is based in Stuttgart, and my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but the Africans didn't really want to have the African Command led by the U.S. on the continent of Africa. And I think that's probably still right, even though we do have a large military presence. I'm actually in the middle of now working with one of my colleagues to do a congressional delegation to AFRICOM and throughout many of the countries, because I want to get a hands-on look at U.S. military involvement on the continent. One of the things that's very concerning about the new administration so far is that there's been this quiet military buildup, and we don't know necessarily why. Because there's not a coherent foreign policy, period, but there's not a coherent foreign policy in regard to Africa. We don't really understand what they're doing. And so you saw, I guess, in the last week, the soldiers that were ambushed in Niger. So I do think that one of the most important things our military could do in training is to train the militaries on the continent of Africa to understand that they are the military for the country and not the military for the president at the time, because that's where things go south. And then, we have other situations that have gone south. We trained the military in Mali and they thought a lot of themselves, and so they took over the government. The democracy and governance issues are real critical.
You mentioned the wonderful success of the PEPFAR program. And in anticipation of budget cuts to CDC for that program, they're looking at concentrating on the places where the program has done well and neglecting the places the program has not done well. And I wondered what your approach to that would be.
I think that's crazy. I mean, I don't think that should happen. The other thing that has happened in the past, which this is so typical of funding period, in the government, you get money and you're doing well, and we say, oh, great, then we cut it off. You know what I mean? And so I visited a number of countries where they were worried. This was actually under the Obama administration. They were worried about cuts to PEPFAR because things were getting better. And again, I think everything should be geared toward internal capacity. But for something that is so critical, they have pretty much eliminated maternal child transmission of HIV on the continent of Africa. That's huge, considering where the epidemic was, 10, 15 years ago.
Congresswoman, I wanted to ask you about Kenya. I went there for the Obama administration with NDI delegation prior to the election. Talked to a lot of young people, very educated, very energetic. But when talked about who they were going to vote for, it was purely based on tribalism, not based on the best candidate with their views. Can you give us a little insight on the last election? I understand you're going to go there for NDI, and so I'd just like to have your views.
Sure. It was very exciting. It was the first time I had done that. I went. The election was in August, and I was there for the election, and it was very impressive. I was stunned at the Supreme Court decision to throw the election out. But let me just tell you a little bit about how they conducted their election, because I thought, ooh, we could learn something. But anyway, it was a very grassroots process, but in every precinct, you had the opposition there. So if you could imagine, in every polling place, you had Democrats, Republicans, and whoever else literally sitting there the entire time, watching the entire process. And so what happened, and the reason why the Supreme Court threw it out, was because what they didn't anticipate, and of course they should have, but they didn't, after all of the votes were tabulated, then an individual precinct was supposed to scan a tally back to the headquarters. The headquarters, by the way, was in a convention center, and it was open 24 hours, and it was televised, so you could see everything that was happening in the convention center. Well, you had 40,000 polling places and 40,000 people transmitting results into the central headquarters. The opponent, the guy that lost, and it was his fourth time losing, he said that the election was hacked, and it made me feel like when he came in, it was like, I guess everybody that loses now is going to say their election is hacked. He came in and brought us proof that it was hacked, and then the proof was really crazy, and it was disputed. But that's why the Supreme Court threw it out, not because they thought the election overall was fraudulent, but because of the delay in transmission. So the results didn't come in completely for 2 or 3 days. Now, listen to this. They threw it out. The new election is October 28th, I think, is the date. And the guy that called for the Supreme Court to examine the election has decided to pull out. So he's not running. And so, anyway, and the other thing about it is that Kenyatta, the sitting president, won by 1.4 million votes. So it wasn't like it was a close call. So that's why I was really surprised, by that. But the election that just happened last week was in Liberia, and their runoff is in a couple of weeks. So it'll be interesting to see.
Great. Is there a question over here? Yeah, please.
Yes, you made the comment about Botswana being very successful because they put their diamond industry back and given to the people and helped their government. Here you have Nigeria, which is probably one of the richest countries in resources in the world. You have a Muslim leader, and yet Boko Haram is still powerful, still disastrous in what they're doing, and the people of Nigeria don't seem to get any benefit from any of the resources. How do you propose that we could help them get some resources, just the people?
Well, I think, helping helping in Nigeria, again, them build out their infrastructure. You mentioned that the president was Muslim. I mean, the tradition in Nigeria is that for every time there's a change, it goes from north to south. So you have a Christian and you have a Muslim. So him being a Muslim, I don't think really is connected at all to Boko Haram. In fact, I'm sure Boko Haram would have his head quicker than they would, someone else. I worry about Nigeria because that particular president was very frail and fragile when he was elected. And he's been out of the country for a long time. I think he had the best intentions in the world, and he made fighting corruption his number one priority, but then he's been ill and out of the country. And so I think that has been a real problem. I don't know if I think it's the richest country in terms of natural resources. I would think of the Democratic Republic of the Congo, frankly, that has, oil and diamonds and everything else under the sun. But you know what, though? When it comes to some of these countries that have all of these resources, we can look at the countries as much as you want. But we need to look at the other companies and countries that are taking those resources. They need to be held accountable as well. And I'm very interested in that in terms of our own country, our own companies. We have put a lot of checks and balances in our own system, but I think we make a mistake if we just look at the countries without looking at the international companies that are complicit.
May I use my prerogative to ask a follow-up question on that?
Oh, you have your mic.
In terms of the role of Congress, because one thing that has happened in the past by statute, a requirement that companies, as they're drawing minerals, for instance, from the Congo, need to ensure that they're not drawn from an area of conflict and that they need to meet certain regulations that relate back to the SEC and that really affect their ability in terms of filings. That, though, is another issue that the administration has expressed a lack of support for and has sought to claw back. Within Congress, do your colleagues share this perspective that it's a congressional role, that by statute, these issues are important to hold companies to account, to ensure transparency, to ensure that we're avoiding conflict minerals and the like?
Well, I think for the most part, my colleagues agree with that until it becomes to a specific company they have contact with. But I do think in general there is support for that. But, we passed legislation, I'd love to know what you think about this. We passed legislation on conflict minerals specifically.
Right.
And one of the problems was there was a loophole that then companies were just going and getting those same minerals from China and avoiding it. The Chinese would mine the minerals, in other words. And so I know some folks want to look at the conflict mineral legislation and try to figure out how to close the loophole, but close the loophole in a way that it's not hurting the companies either.
Great. Thank you. Yes.
Thank you for being here with us. My question is in regards to, we always think of Africa, but we don't think of the Maghreb, Northern Africa, as really being part of Africa. My question to you is, how is Sub-Saharan Africa working with the Maghreb nations and vice versa, and how do they interact? Thank you.
Well, I think it's, different places. I do think of the continent as a whole. In Congress, we have divided the continent. So, for example, jurisdiction-wise, in the committee, there is a committee that covers North Africa and the Middle East, and then our committee that covers Africa. So, there is that division. But, I think it's different. I can think of two examples. Morocco. Morocco does a lot in terms of supporting sub-Saharan Africa. They have a lot of policies that support students from sub-Saharan Africa. And then there's Libya. And Libya is causing all kinds of problems in sub-Saharan Africa because when Libya collapsed, all of the weapons that Gaddafi had, it led immediately to a coup in Mali. So there have been a lot of spillover problems because of the fact that, Libya is not really governed right now. So it's different per country.
Great. Oh, yes, please. Sorry, I didn't see you earlier.
So, hi, my name is Rachel Cardone. I'm the Water Scarcity Project Fellow here at the Pacific Council. And thank you, Congresswoman, for all your remarks. I've spent a lot of time and done a lot of work in sub-Saharan Africa over the years, and from a water scarcity lens and from a water supply and sanitation lens. And so as you're talking about economic development and these root causes and the need for infrastructure, and likewise in later in your comments talking about the famines that are happening on the continent, wondering if you could give some context or in terms of how you are thinking about water scarcity and water security and how that influences both economic development as well as social development and security considerations.
Well,
Thank you.
again, I think it's a perfect example of where if the infrastructure was strong in a lot of places, and by the way, one of the things that needs to happen infrastructure-wise that the Africans can do for themselves, does not relate to us, is that they also have a lot of trade restrictions and barriers in between the countries on the continent. And so that's one thing that needs to happen to change, and it's a real economic issue because you have some countries that are extremely small and could never get to economies of scale unless they worked in the context of their regional economic communities. And when I think of water, I think of it the same way because, you have countries that have tremendous water resources, but they don't necessarily have the infrastructure to really manage that, either from a conservation, dams, whatever, perspective, and also being able to share between countries. So I mentioned the famine in the 4 countries. Yemen was the 4th country that's not African, but the near famine conditions in Somalia are because of drought. And it would be a way that, the countries could cooperate. You have Ethiopia that's building a major dam, and then you have Somalia that's, experiencing drought. So to the extent that we can work with the countries in building infrastructure, and I would include water as a key area of infrastructure.
Great. Well, I wanted to give you a moment as well to sum up. You've gotten a diverse set of questions, and I think they teed off nicely your remarks of painting a broad and diverse picture of the continent. But we're very appreciative of your time. I wanted to give you the last word, of course.
Sure. Well, first of all, this was very nice to work with you. We also miss Grant being there. Being in the administration, we miss Grant. I don't know, you couldn't be in this one, but anyway. I do look forward to working with you and hope that Grant will be able to play a key role with the Pacific Council in helping us to get this trade mission done. So let me just say that I'm just so appreciative that you're looking at Africa, that you highlighted and lifted up the issues related to the continent of Africa today in your conference, and I look forward to being more involved with the Pacific Council in the future.
Great. Please join me in welcoming and thanking Congressmember Bass. Thank you very much for your leadership.